Welcome to Season 4 of She Ventures. I am your host, Doria Lavanino. She Ventures is a podcast about women who are pivoting in their lives and careers. We live in a world where women of color founders raise 0.5% of all venture capital in 2020, and women overall a paltry 2.2%. This podcast is about elevating women's voices. Our new website, sheventurespodcast.com, provides resources, actionable tips, mentorship, and community. We do not subscribe to the idea that there is a dearth of fundable ideas from women. There is no pipeline problem. There may be a visibility problem, and that is what we are here to fix together. Let's talk about the reality of women, money, entrepreneurship, and work-life balance on this season of She Ventures. It's a safe bet today's guest never let gender stereotypes stand in the way of her success. A graduate with distinction from the United States Air Force Academy with a double major in math and operations research, she went on to serve in the Air Force for 5 years, received her master's degree as a Draper Fellow at where? Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and served as a data scientist in the Air Force at Pearl Harbor. Interested to learn more about that, data mining fueled her pivot to entrepreneurship, most recently as co-founder and CEO of Novi, a B2B marketplace for transparency of raw materials in consumer goods. Kimberly Shenk, welcome to She Ventures.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your early influences in your life.
When I grew up, my dad actually flew search and rescue for the California Highway Patrol. And my mom was a preschool teacher and actually still is. A lot of what I grew up around was this fundamental value of service and serving others. My mom's so passionate about kids and serving families, and my dad's extremely passionate about, flying, but also serving others and in the capacity of working for the California Highway Patrol. So that was a lot of my upbringing and example, and grew up in Northern California in a very kind of rural environment, but yeah.
Nice. And was it because your dad flew that you became interested in flying?
Yes, I was very fascinated. He worked an hour and a half drive away from where we lived. And actually, we ended up owning a small aircraft so that he could commute to work by flying there. And so I was introduced to flying at a very early age for that reason. I ended up flying and getting my private pilot's license when I was 17. So at the same time, I was getting my driver's license pretty much.
That's amazing. Is that still what people can do? Like if you have enough hours?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there, even if you were like 12 and had enough hours?
There's a limit. There's an age. And I think the minimum age is still 16 to get your private pilot's license. But it's kind of scary to think that you could send a 16-year-old on their own in a plane unsupervised to fly across the country, which is what I did.
But you seem to do it quite well because you, pun intended, landed at the Air Force Academy.
Yeah.
How did that come about? How did you research options for college, et cetera? And how did you decide going there?
Well, I think the first piece was just this motivation to serve and figuring out where I was going to serve the greater good. And I felt like serving my country was an awesome opportunity to do that. I was also very passionate about flying. And so I wanted to become a fighter pilot. And then another really interesting piece, I played volleyball, and I was very interested in playing volleyball in college. And the Air Force Academy is actually a Division I school in the Mountain West Conference. And so I got recruited to play volleyball there as well.
Of course you did. So is that where, I know a little bit about this, just a teeny bit, basically Division I, I'm a little out of my depth here. Do they give you a scholarship to join?
Well, typically at other colleges, that is exactly what happens. And in this case, because you are going to a military academy, everybody is under scholarship because in exchange, you serve in the military for a number of years after graduation.
Does that amount vary depending?
No, actually, everybody that graduates from an academy has a 5-year service commitment as an officer in the military, and then you can choose to stay on further years after that.
You are an example of a woman who you were either, and I would love to know, either unaffected or not stymied by gender stereotypes. And I say this because I think I'm a mom of 2 teenage daughters, and research shows that girls start to internalize and define themselves with some positive, but also with some kind of harmful stereotypes as early as middle school about things like I'm not good at math or my body image, etc. And these are really serious issues for a lot of young women. Not wanting to take up space, another one. So I realize these are generalizations. There are some young women out there that do not have these issues. But what was the difference, do you think, about your upbringing or your way of approaching life?
I actually give a ton of credit to my dad, who basically just instilled and encouraged this: you can do whatever you want and don't let anybody stop you. And I think I was introduced to things that typically men would do, right? Like flying. And there were just things that he never introduced, even the concept of gender, to me. So I never had that thought in my mind that this was only a man's world. And I think it was really interesting and an eye opener, and probably a little bit of naivete as I was applying for the Air Force Academy, to learn that only 17% of the class is female. And that's a very high number. And traditionally it's 15%. And I was actually shocked to think like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be the only girl there. But I think a lot of that is, I also grew up in a rural environment. And so there wasn't a ton of outside pressures in that. And it didn't really occur to me till later. So I think that's a really interesting question, is my dad had a bunch of influence on that.
That's wonderful. And then when you did realize it, how did it feel to be the one young woman in a class of guys?
I embraced it. I am extremely competitive. And so I actually loved it, especially when you go to the Air Force Academy, you have a stint of time before where you're going through boot camp essentially, and being able to do more push-ups or more pull-ups or run faster than some of the guys was obviously something that fueled me. And I just love to do that. So yeah, I kind of just took it on a challenge. And yeah, the competition piece really stuck out.
I was thinking to myself, the only example that comes to mind from an athletic perspective for me was I decided when I turned 40 that I was going to run the New York City Marathon. And I trained for 2 years and I did it. But I remember at mile 16, it's where you turn to go on the Queensboro Bridge, and it's uphill, it's cold, and no one is cheering for you at that point. And I remember I ran the whole thing. I ran slow, but I ran. And I started to pass these like pretty built dudes. And it took kind of a mental fortitude as well, because I'm thinking, wow, I must really be in much better shape than I thought, And then you come off the Queensboro Bridge and people start cheering, and it is a great feeling.
I love that. Yes, it is. It's so satisfying. It's fueling. And then you're like, okay, no, I'm going to pick it up.
Exactly. So you became interested in data analytics and data mining. And wow, what drew you to that?
Well, it's crazy. I mean, I was set on being a pilot. I had even gotten my incentive ride in an F-16, which is an incredible experience, by the way. Ultimately, I was also at the academy starting to take a ton of math classes and just fell in love with the concept of what it can do. And I had an instructor that was very influential on me and a lot of the stuff that he had done in his career. And I just started to think that that was something I wanted to do in my future, and ultimately decided to depart from the fighter pilot life and journey and switched completely over into becoming a data scientist.
And that you did, and went to MIT. Gosh, talk about exclusive, probably like 1% acceptance rate. So how did that go for you?
Yeah, that's such an interesting story. I mean, honestly, because if you're graduating from an academy, you're required to go on and serve. And to be able to go to a graduate program is actually a very hard thing to convince, first off, the military to let you do, but then also to get in. So I ended up flying myself out to MIT and almost begging the head of the Department of Operations Research to let me in and take classes and study for my master's degree. So that was an amazing experience. And I got to work for the Draper Laboratory as a Draper Fellow and do work for the Naval Health Research Institute. And I still had to have a full-time job as an officer in the Air Force. And so I balanced that alongside my work. But that was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. When they say MIT is hard, it's not a joke. It was like, I don't think I've ever felt dumb in my life until I went there.
There are a lot of really smart people.
Amazing.
I can only, yeah. You were working full-time and going to school full-time. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
My goodness. So I'm sure you had a lot of time to play volleyball.
Not as well. There's an interesting story in there. I ended up, after graduating the academy, there's a team in the Air Force that is essentially the all military team for each sport. In other countries, the one element of your duty as being a citizen in a country is to serve in the military. And a lot of countries do this. And for professional athletes, they will place them on a military team so that they can continue training. And so all of the militaries will get together and play. They call it the Military World Olympics. And usually you're pressure testing the Olympic training sites before the Olympics happen. And so I got to play on the military world team for the entire military for the volleyball team. And we got to go pressure test the Olympic site in Rio, which was really cool. Yeah. But they didn't have hot water yet. So that was like pretty cold showers. But yeah, so that was a fun experience. So I still got to play a little bit of volleyball.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Very, very cool. Wow. And then I was interested, and I think listeners would like to know in layperson's terms, as much as it can be, that you then were deployed to Pearl Harbor, where you were a data scientist for the Pacific Air Force. What does that job entail?
It is so beautiful in the fact that stationed in Hawaii, but it's a top secret security clearance. So obviously you're handling a lot of very confidential information. And so I got to work in what they call a skiff, where you have to have a badge to get in and you have to lock up all of your stuff in another locker in a safe before you can even leave the building. And so didn't have windows in my office. Let's put it that way. But very, very amazing opportunity to have access to, I worked directly with the 3-star general, got to do a lot of the analysis that led our decisions in the Pacific, just really cool work. Obviously, still to this day, can't talk about any of it. But
I realized that. Yeah. Like, I guess she can't tell us.
Yeah.
Because it might be, who knows who's listening. And they heard all of United States security in the Pacific on She Ventures podcast. Who knew?
Exactly.
Okay. So after leaving the Air Force, you seem to dabble kind of, and I don't mean that like you didn't take it seriously, because obviously everything you do with great passion, but equally with entrepreneurship, as you did kind of working with big companies such as Eventbrite, right?
Yep.
Before your current venture, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, what were some of the pros and cons of working for startups versus big companies, albeit I think always in the data universe?
So I was, after separating and getting out as a captain in the Air Force, just like fascinated about tech in general. And a lot of what I had studied at MIT had applications in AI. And there's just a lot of future stuff happening in tech that was leveraging AI. And so for me, I think what's interesting actually is my very first job out of the Air Force, I worked as a data scientist for Sports Authority, which is like a blast from the past. But that was actually my first big company experience, because at the time they were still a large company. And I got to see the inner workings of how, all these different, I just never had that context before. And so it was very interesting. It operates very completely differently than the military does, obviously. And there's a bunch of different departments that I had never had any exposure to, like marketing before. So that was, I almost call it like a mini business school in a way, just understanding how businesses operate. And when I moved into Eventbrite, I actually joined when they were pretty early on. And so still in that startup phase. And for me, what I learned there is a lot about, well, in the context of what I do today, network driven business models. And, Eventbrite was one of those, but I also built and led the data science organization there. And so that was where I, leveraged a lot of, when you're at the academy and in the military, leadership is just like something that you do innately and you are trained in. And I hadn't actually had the opportunity to apply that in the business side yet. And so that was my first opportunity to really leverage a lot of those skills. And I learned that I loved doing that. I just loved building teams and pulling people together to accomplish something around the concept of data. And that was my focus in that organization.
I never thought about that, but yeah, right. The military is different completely in terms of hierarchy, and companies do have hierarchy, but they also have politics and all sorts of things. So that must have really been quite a mind shift.
Definitely a mind shift. It's not a yes, sir, no, ma'am, can salute and take your orders and go on. But I loved it. I felt like I thrived and I really found my place in being able to leverage a lot of the great stuff that I learned in the military about leadership, but then layering that on with a lot of the cool stuff that you get to do with the freedom, a little bit more freedom and less guardrails in business. So
for listeners who are starting their career or are maybe pivoting and are looking at whether they would like to work at a big company versus a startup, what is your experience at both of them, pros and cons?
It's for me, very stark. In a larger company, the folks that thrive there, and I learned actually this was not me, but it's where you need a lot of structure, which you might say that sounds crazy because I came from the military, which is a lot of structure. But essentially, it's a opportunity where you want to see best practices, potentially a well-oiled machine, learn from people who have senior experience, lots of years of doing the craft or the thing that you're joining a company to do, and largely have a very important but probably defined and smaller piece of the pie that is what your job is hired to be a cog in the wheel. And I don't say that negatively. A lot of people thrive in that environment, but it's mostly like stepping in to do a well-defined role with clear boundaries. In a startup, you are joining something that has a ton of ambiguity. You're going to wear a bunch of different hats. Nobody's going to know what they're doing. It's not going to be a great process. You're not going to be able to look up to somebody and be like, oh, you have 10 years of doing this thing. But it's exciting because you get to write your own rules. You get to get your hands dirty. You might be doing, a customer call one day and then coding in the back end on the platform the next day. Like you're all over the place, but it's more thrilling. And so you have to be okay with that ambiguity and lack of structure.
That's a great answer. And I like the fact that it was one not of judgment on either side, because it really depends on what's right for the person.
Yeah.
What led you to start Novi? And again, in simple terms, what is the purpose of the company and where did the idea originate from?
Part of my upbringing, and this goes a little bit back to growing up in a more rural environment where when I say that, I had 40 acres of nothing around us. And then going into the military, I just have always had this passion for the environment and for health, for wellness. And when I was at Eventbrite, I was very close with the chief marketing officer of the time. Her name is Jaleh Bisharat, and her and I bonded over this common passion. And when we both had left Eventbrite and had gone our separate ways and were in different companies, but we kept meeting up for lunch and talking about how we could maybe do something together to just address our passion. And so actually in 2017, right around this time, I also got pregnant and I started to just become obsessed with the different types of products I was using, what kinds of ingredients were being used, the impacts they had on my health, the health of my growing baby, the environment, all these things. And naturally, as a data scientist, I started creating spreadsheets of ingredients and trying to understand the landscape. And so all of this kind of culminated into starting the original company that we started called Naked Poppy with Jaleh. And basically the approach was to build clean or better for your health, better for the environment, personal care products. That was my first, it was a startup. We raised venture capital. And I got very close to the manufacturing side of the business. And so that was where we were actually developing the products that we wanted to sell as a brand. The whole thing was shocking to me in the fact that we wanted to use data to build these better products, and there was no data to be found.
That is shocking.
Yeah. And I didn't actually understand how brands create products. And I had a misconception that these brands understand information about the materials they're using and the impacts of these chemicals. Some of these products we use have 50 chemicals in them, and where the chemicals are coming from and how they're made. And that was very much not the case.
So just like to back up for a sec, without naming, I mean, there are big companies like Procter & Gamble, all of those. Is it something that is true across the industry that
Yes.
Scientists, they don't even have scientists that are like, how does that work? Yeah.
So there's absolutely extremely intelligent scientists and chemists out there doing this and building products. It goes back to, if you're going to select a chemical to go into your product, you are going to know if that will make the product more foaming or nicer when you put the lotion on your hand. But when it comes to the toxicity of that chemical or the impact that chemical might have on the environment once it's washed down the drain or thrown into the trash, that's not available, and people are not taking that into account.
That is so mind-boggling to me. Like, I guess it falls in between like EPA and FDA but my gosh, what a huge
yes. And regulations in the US are very, very lenient. And when I say that, it's because there are none. And I think what's interesting is if you look at the European Union, the EU actually bans about 1,400 different chemicals from personal care products. And we ban, I think at this point, it's still only 13 or 14. It's quite a disparity.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would imagine that that's because commercial interests are driving the people not to ask questions.
It's definitely a world in which, capitalism is thriving. And I think a lot of these companies are not driven by mission, but they're driven by revenue. And I think the interesting piece is that this is shifting, and we're seeing consumers waking up to the fact that they want to know what's in their products. We see climate change happening. We're starting to put our dollars in different places. And actually, what's really amazing is because of that, a lot of companies are now out there searching to figure this out and find better sourced materials. And that's exactly what Novi does.
That is fantastic. And you're so right about this, because I have 2 Gen Z daughters, and they're super aware of, and that can also be used. And that's why it's so important to work with ethical companies, because so many companies say that they're quote unquote organic or natural, but it has no real yardstick, right?
Exactly.
I want to ask about your raise of venture capital, but I want to ask you before that. I am a company and I come to Novi. I want to know, I guess I would present you with the chemicals that I use. Tell me how a company would work with you.
So there's 2 ways that we work with different companies and brands. And one is, so we are a marketplace essentially for materials. And so we work with hundreds and hundreds of different suppliers all over the world. I think actually we're in 43 different countries at this point who are making things like the chemicals or the ingredients that you would put into a face wash you're making, or packaging, the bottle that it's going to go into, or the fragrance that's going to be used. And essentially, we, through the data lens, are capturing a ton of information on all of these materials and surfacing it to help a brand as they're trying to say, I want to create this organic or vegan or biodegradable thing, how do I find materials that meet those standards for health and sustainability that I care about? And so we are, through the marketplace lens, are helping them find those materials and purchase them. So that would be the most common use case. And then the second one is, I already have this face wash that I've built and it's been selling in market. And I actually want to understand more information about the materials I'm using and potentially even swap out different, like, the glycerin I'm using isn't sourced responsibly and it's burning down rainforests, and I want to find responsibly sourced glycerin. How do I do that? And so we help the brand learn more about the ingredients that they're currently using and then find alternatives that are better for the environment and health.
What are the criteria for someone to be considered as a supplier for you?
We actually, and this is kind of going back to the data side of it, do not have an opinion, and we don't put out a definition of good or bad. And we've done that kind of on purpose because in the journey of making better products and towards sustainability, it is in fact a journey, and everybody starts on that journey in different parts of the spectrum. And so from the data lens, if we are more of a help you make your decision with the information that you need at your fingertips, then we can help you. If you're more focused on trying to make an environmental impact versus a health impact, you can focus more on those data points. When we work with suppliers, some suppliers are more focused on the environmental side, some are more focused on the health side. We just leverage the data that they have and present that to the brand to help them make an informed decision.
And how do you verify it?
So a lot of this information, if you think about, like you had mentioned, the chemical industry, it is these chemistries or these ingredients are created by scientists who are extremely intelligent, and they document their information in very formal ways. We leverage, it's a massive, massive amounts of documentation, but we leverage official documents that have manufacturing principle, like everything that would go into creating a chemical. And then basically through the technology that we've built, we ingest it and digitize it. And so that's the whole concept of.
Incredible. And how many chemicals or materials do you have in your database?
At this point, where I think we're approaching about 80,000, that is just for our primary focus in our early stages has been in the beauty and personal care market. And so that's everything from, color cosmetics to hair care to chapstick to deodorant. And so that's going to grow extensively as we move into household cleaning, which we're leaning into now. And like other areas like food, ingestibles, like vitamins and things like that.
How can a small business, I'm a small business owner and you've worked at startups, cash is tight, right? So can a small business leverage your services, or is it something that's better done a little bit later when you have traction?
I love that you asked that, because that is the whole mission and vision and why I wanted to build this business. I think there's the up and coming and the smaller brands I've found are the ones that are driving the innovation and care and want to make the impact. The whole point of Novi is not only to find better materials, but actually to have access. A lot of what we're doing is providing financing and negotiating better pricing. And the whole point of that is so a small brand. And we work with brands that are actually pre-launch, like don't even have a product in market yet, so that they have the accessibility or the means to actually purchase the materials so that they can create those products. Yeah.
That's great. I was looking on your website and I read an article about supply chain issues, and there's such a big deal right now. And so someone potentially could work with you knowing ahead of time that X, Y, or Z may be happening to help their company.
Yes. A lot of what we find also is that, hey, supply chain, I've just got to find an alternative material because I can't get the one I've been using. And so it's another amazing use case. I mean, not an amazing dynamic for the industry, but also but we're able to help in that case.
Yes, I think it was kind of like an unforeseen, I hate to use the word benefit when it comes to COVID, but it disrupted the supply chain. So the fact that you can help is great. You, I'm sure, know the statistic that women-led companies or women-founded companies raise 2.3% of venture capital. You raised more than $10 million with your co-founder. What tips can you share with listeners about what worked for you? Why do you think you're part of the 2%?
Yeah, I think so. When I reflect back on it, I will be honest that raising money as a female is probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And it's largely because I think, this is still a stereotype and I don't want to make a generalization, but I do think there's a dynamic where it's a sales pitch. When you go out to raise money, you are definitely doing sales and it's your job to storytell. There's an element of grandiose and gravitas that you have to bring to the room. And I think there's two things propagating it. One is in an environment where men have been predominantly the ones filling that space. And so driving what that looks like and setting the example for many years on what this gravitas should look like. But then two, women just potentially, or in my case, not being that way and being a little bit more, it's more analytical on where you are today and wanting to showcase that element of it and maybe not selling so much into the future. I've just seen that the reaction and what I've noticed, and I've talked to so many different female founders about this, is that you're held to a standard where investors want to see more. They want to see more of what you've done and more proof. And I think it's really interesting because you'll talk to men that are at the same stage as you and have the same numbers, but are not asked to show that proof. And they can sell more of this vision into the future of come along with me on that. That was just like a lot of what I had to work on. And I ended up working with an amazing coach to think through how I communicate my story and talk about vision and do that in a comfortable way that didn't feel like I was bragging or just, the things that I didn't feel natural to me. And that's kind of what I had to focus on because I knew that was going to be a weakness of mine going into fundraising.
How many people or companies did you, or venture capital firms, angel firm, whatever they all are, how many did you have to pitch?
That's a really good question. I never actually kept track. I've had a bajillion conversations.
That's a big number.
Yeah. And learning process, like you learn and you get said no to, and it's crushing and you have to pick yourself back up and learn why. But I will say that I was very fortunate to work closely with somebody at Eventbrite who ended up going on to become an investor. And because of the pre-existing relationship that we had and knew each other so well, in our very first round, our seed round, when we raised $1.5 million, he was the first person I called and he ended up putting that check in. And so I do think from that perspective, there's the relationship side of fundraising and finding people that you trust and building those relationships.
Absolutely. Networking, I hear over and over again, and not just in the sense of exchanging business cards, but like how you're talking about, like having meaningful relationships with people.
Exactly.
Traction to date, how has it been?
It's been incredible. I mean, I think the thing we saw is over the past year, just 9x, 10x, close to 10x growth in our customer base. We pretty much just exploded across the beauty and personal care space, which has been very, very exciting for us. And so this next year, a lot of the focus actually is taking the learnings in the playbook and starting to expand. The opportunity is tremendous. I mean, the chemical industry, if you probably don't know this, but is a $5 trillion industry. So for us, that's what we're trying to tackle, is taking that on and bringing it online. And
is that the ultimate goal, is to have every chemical, in the world in your database with data points?
Absolutely. And honestly, I think the piece of that, which is the most exciting part and aligns with our mission, is that as we are driving commerce in this industry and exposing it and essentially bringing transparency to it, it's going to start turning over to brands actually deciding, because they can and they have the information at their fingertips, to purchase better materials for the environment and human health. So the whole point of this is we just want better products in the hands of consumers. So if we can bring the purchasing of the materials that goes into those products online and make it more transparent and enable brands to make better decisions, that's what's going to accelerate that.
So it could be at some point that businesses could just log on, like have a tiered membership. I'm not really sure, and look up chemicals with their scientific team if they had one.
Absolutely. That's exactly right.
That is incredible and just really amazing to me that it's not been thought of before.
Yeah.
Wow. You have worked in male dominated industries. You had said this before earlier in the podcast for much of your life. How have you been received as a woman and as a mother?
I think so. It's interesting on the mother part. I think that's actually been a very positive piece of the puzzle. I think as a woman without children, and I think you're just viewed as very young and naive. And I think actually having my daughter and talking to that, especially even when I'm still at the chemical industry and honestly, the CPG industry is very male dominated as well. But bringing that up gives me, whether it's good or bad, just more of a point to credibility of, oh, you're old enough to have a family. You must have done something in your life, kind of thing. So that's what I've experienced, at least.
That's good to know. And anyone who looks at your resume, I just find it hard to believe that they would have any difficulty knowing that you're qualified. Do you think that women in STEM have a unique perspective to offer?
From my perspective, I've always found that in these fields, particularly STEM or the military or just anything where female presence has not been traditionally there, it's just a whole new perspective and way of problem solving and looking at the problem that women bring to the table. And I think that even extends into when you think about leadership, board members, your executive staff. There's just a different way. And I think it's great. It's a balance to the conversation and to the point of view. And so from that perspective, like I do think everybody brings something different to the table, whether or not you're men or women. But I do believe that women bring a very different lens to problem solving.
You've served on a board or two, or are currently, right?
Yes.
So you've seen that in action.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask before we wrap up, I just had one more question about Novi. How do you earn money?
So the way that we earn money is through the transaction. And so you can think of it as any typical e-commerce site where, you're going on to buy something. There's a cut that's negotiated between the buyer and the person or the seller and the platform. And so that's exactly what we do. As a brand is purchasing material, we'll take a cut of the transaction of that material. So we only win if the brand wins.
That's a good way to be aligned.
Yeah.
So last question before we talk about where listeners can find out more about you and Novi. Actually, I have two. I'm sorry. Because you're so into AI, where do you see big data evolving into in the next 3 years and having the biggest impact?
I think the interesting piece about AI and data is it's only good as the data source that it's coming from. But I think we've traditionally been in a space where we have lots of data, but we're not leveraging it in intelligent ways. And so I think it's just going to start evolving into a place where we're leveraging it better, but we're also doing, and when I say better, we're doing it in respectful ways to people's privacy. I think there's a lot of inappropriate ways that data is used to continue to drive anti-diversity, drive the gender gap, create these biases. And so there's a responsible way of using data to make sure that that's not incorporated into the models and the AI that we're using. So I think there's going to be a lot more into the algorithms and how we're using the data. And before, I think it was a lot of just capturing mega amounts of information.
When you say that, I know this is such a small example, but I think it's one that resonates with people. It's like when you look at something online and then because of a cookie, it follows you everywhere for the next week or year,
Yep.
It's just, it can be quite annoying.
Yep.
Last question is, what advice would you give to your younger self being where you are today?
Oh, I think there are definitive moments that I know and I can remember in my younger days when I was told that I couldn't do something or that wasn't possible. Those had very large impacts on me. And so I think I would tell myself that, like, just blow through that barrier, ignore it, and keep moving on. Don't even give it a second thought, because the future you and what you're going to be able to do, like, that is unconsequential. And so I think there was just, yeah.
Do you feel comfortable giving one example?
Absolutely. Well, the one that's coming to mind, I had a difficult coach in high school when I was playing volleyball, and he told me that I would never amount to anything or play in college. And it made me reconsider if I was ever going to do that. And, I took a long time, like, evaluating my life. And then I ended up actually getting to play in college. So I just, like, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, coach, I hope you're listening to this
Yes.
now. Oh, gosh. No, we do all internalize those things. And you have done so much and inspire many. Where can listeners learn more about Novi or about you?
So you can obviously go to our website, which is noviconnect.com. Find us on Instagram at noviconnect. We also are on Facebook at Novi Connect and LinkedIn. So those are our main places.
Fantastic. I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It was wonderful chatting with you. I've really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to She Ventures. Like what you heard? You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.